Hello, and welcome to the Early American Brass Band Podcast. I'm Chris Troiano, joined always by Stephen Canestracey.
Hello.
And we are talking with Jari Villanueva, our first return guest. Jari is going to be talking about the 26th North Carolina Regimental Band and kind of their history pre, during, and post-Civil War, and how their band currently exists at 26th North Carolina Regimental Band today. So really interesting talk. Glad we didn't scare Jari away the first time and he was willing to come back a second time. But yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was great to catch up with Jari, hear what he's been up to since we had him on the last time. And I was really happy that we were able to dedicate a whole episode just to one band. We've done that in the past, I think, with two other bands, with Dr. O'Connor with the 47th Pennsylvania Band and Sue Kinney with the Manchester Band. So it was great to get Jari on to talk about the 26th North Carolina Band, which has a very rich and interesting history. And we hope that you'll learn something that you maybe didn't know before by listening to the podcast. And as is always the case, if you like what you're hearing, a very great way to support the podcast is to share and like and comment on social media and YouTube. We also have a brand new way that we mentioned in the last episode with Rodney Marsalis, but we now have a Patreon page. So if you feel so compelled, you can go over to www.patreon.com. That's patreon.com/EABB podcast. And you can take a look at the tiers there and select which one works best for you. There's no obligation to do that, but we do appreciate any support you'd be willing to give over on Patreon.
Without further ado, here is episode 22 featuring Jari Villanueva. Enjoy. Welcome back, Jari Villanueva, to the Early American Brass Band Podcast. Thank you so much for coming back and being our first returning guest.
Thanks. It's my honor to be here. Had a great time the first time around, and honored to be back here and happy to talk about a terrific band from the Civil War.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. So the 26th North Carolina Regiment Band, we all know that the Frederick Fennell album, the Eastman Wind Ensemble album, he says that he was inspired to get into Civil War music because he was reading the accounts of Gettysburg and hearing a brass band playing on the fields of Gettysburg, and we assume that that's the 26th North Carolina. How did this band kind of get on your radar and become an ensemble that you wanted to research and eventually perform as?
Well, when we formed the Federal City Brass Band around 2002, our idea with that particular band was to have a more generic band that would tell the story of all Union bands through its music and through the history and the uniforms and stuff. But then as that band became successful, we wanted to look at doing something that was more concentrated, a single band with a history, and we wanted to tell their story. Mm-hmm. And we looked at other bands that were doing similar things, like the 1st Brigade Band, the Wildcat Band, which was part of the 105th Pennsylvania, the 47th Band, the 47th Pennsylvania Band, which was under the direction of Thomas Coates. And of course, the Saxons Band, which was not a military band, but it's a band that was popular during the middle part of the 19th century. And of course, there were community bands, and we looked at community bands that have this lineage to the Civil War. I mean, the Ringgold Band, the Repaz Band, they all had a Civil War connection. And then we decided, well, we're doing a Union band. It would be great to try and do a Confederate band. But of course, there are very few Confederate bands to look at. And, the records weren't very well kept. When I say there are few bands to look at, there were actually, during the war, there were many, many bands. It's just unfortunate that there are not good records that were kept. So looking at some of the bands that were recreated, like the 4th Georgia, which was the Americus Brass Band. Those guys were reenacting during the 1970s, and they were doing it correctly. They wore the proper uniforms. They were going out to reenactments and portraying themselves as the 4th Georgia from the Georgia town of Americus. There's also the 8th Georgia Band. They do a wonderful job of recreating Confederate music. We also looked at the 5th Alabama, which is more of a community type band today. And then, of course, the Stonewall Brigade Band, which was part of the 5th Virginia Infantry, part of Stonewall's brigade during the Civil War. But there was not much known about these bands. The band books don't exist anymore. There were very few diaries that were kept by those musicians. So we wanted to actually find a band that had a good story. We wanted to have something that told a story that was interesting and quite compelling. And we wanted to have a band that would, not only talk about the Civil War, brass bands in general, but also the life of those involved. And to do that, we looked and found the 26th North Carolina. Now, as you mentioned, and quite accurately, Frederick Fennell talked about the music in that landmark recording that he did with the Eastman Wind Ensemble. In fact, he actually has the quote. He mentions the quote. He says that when he was at Gettysburg and he was reading about it, he comes across the quote from Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Fremantle. And Fremantle writes, quote, "When the cannonade was at its height, a Confederate band of music between the cemetery and ourselves began to play polkas and waltzes, which sounded very curious, accompanied by the hissing and bursting of shells," unquote. So that's the quote that got Fennell wondering, who were those guys and what were they doing? He made this trip over to try to find the spot. And his interest in it led to the 26th North Carolina and a trip down to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, to visit the archives of the Moravian Foundation. Now, by the way, the band that he was talking about not only was the 26th, but it was also the 11th North Carolina they had combined. So that compelling story got us interested, and also, I have a copy of Harry Hall's wonderful book called A Johnny Reb Band from Salem, which I understand you're reading. Have you got through that book yet?
I got through it. I actually was able to buy it from you, and I was able to get through all of it. I need to still lend it to Steven because it's an incredible account. I wonder why HBO hasn't made a series just about this brass band yet. It's crazy.
It's wonderful. And Harry Hall, who we did correspond with, did this book after he did a dissertation on Moravian wind music that he did in 1967 for the George Peabody College, Teachers College. And the whole dissertation is about the history of the Moravian music in the United States. And within the dissertation is a section about the Civil War and the music of the 26th, which then he expanded into the wonderful book, which is now in the second edition. I also found music of the 11th North Carolina Band, which was a reenactment band they had done, I think, in the 1970s. I found some cassette tapes and listening to them. I think they're still in existence. I'm not sure.
Yeah, they've been one of the ones that I've had a hard time tracking down. I was able to get a hold of their Volume 5 on CD, and I'm still trying to kind of go through some names on that one to track down its activity. So yeah, I'll keep you updated.
Please do. I mean, that was one of the groups that, since they had this close relationship with the 26th, they recorded some of the music. of course, they weren't the first ones to record it. Fennell was the first one to record the music from the band books, but they also did do some recordings. And interestingly enough, I had listened to some audio presentation on the history of Gettysburg, and in it was one of the arrangements from the original 26 North Carolina band book that just floored me, because it was a commercial recording and it was being played on modern instruments, but it was definitely an arrangement from that band book.
Yeah.
And so I was curious, like, how in the world did they get this?
Yeah. Right.
So anyway, all that stuff, combined us to start looking and putting together the 26th North Carolina Band, and that's how we got interested in it.
Gotcha.
I was curious, before you guys got a hold of the name and the music and all that stuff, has, to your knowledge, the 26th been reenacted as an ensemble before? Like, had the Moravian Foundation tried to have a reenactment band previously, or were you guys kind of the first ones to adopt them as your ensemble?
We're not the first, actually. During the 1960s in Salem, as part of the Salem Band, they did a recreation of the 26th North Carolina. And it was done, I think, in the early 60s, of course, with the centennial of the Civil War being as popular as it was. Members of the Salem Band put together a group that played. The uniforms, of course, if you look at the 1960s, and the people who reenacted at the time, you'll notice that the uniforms are more in line with, like, Gone with the Wind type impressions. They're not as accurate as they are today, because quite frankly, a lot of people did not have access to a lot of information as we have today with the internet, and being able to actually find more and more photos of what these soldiers looked like and what the uniforms were like. And if I can't remember if that recreated band played on original instruments or not. But anyway, they were recreated at that time. And then in the early 2000s, around 2000, 2001, the Moravian Music Foundation sponsored a recording of a CD called Storm in the Land, which was a brass quintet. Oh gosh, now they're off the tip of my tongue. I think
American Brass Quintet.
Thank you, the American Brass Quintet. And they recorded a whole bunch. They recorded a whole CD of music from the archives, which was terrific.
They actually did too. Was they did a follow-up, Cheer Boys Cheer, and I think that was through the foundation also. Yes,
they did. Very good CDs that helped introduce this music to a wider audience. In reality, it was those folks who were doing it first, but I don't believe that anyone decided to take it to the next level like we did, which I'll talk about.
Yeah. So, Jari, what is kind of the history of the 26? Because as we've mentioned and alluded to, they're tied into the Moravians, and they have a very rich musical history in the United States. So I'm wondering kind of how this band came about.
Well, of course, the history of the 26th North Carolina it's a remarkable story of these brass players from the Moravian community in Salem, North Carolina. And by the way, there are two huge Moravian communities in the United States, one in Salem, Winston-Salem today, of course, and Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Now, the Moravians, they were a small group of Christians that originally formed in 1457, prior to the Protestant Reformation. They settled in the United States in the 18th and early 19th century, and music was an important part of their culture, and part of everyday living, actually. The Moravians brought with them from Europe a very rich musical culture, especially the German tradition of amateur musical organizations. So the original music in Salem was probably a trombone choir. That's one of the traditions that the Moravians have had. If you've always, when you mention Moravian to trombone players, they always smile because they know that it's great trombone music.
Right.
And so the tradition was probably started for church services. Now, in the early part of the 19th century, they had a number of woodwind instruments, but this was basically replaced by all brass instrument in the 1850s when the brass band movement took over. And what music, did these guys play? Well, they played religious music, music that was required at services. Groups would play at the top of the church steeple to announce important events. They would announce deaths, and they would perform, of course, at Easter. The Salem Band we can trace back to the latter part of the 18th century. Actually, George Washington had visited Salem, and according to records, the Salem Band at that time played music. They played God Save George Washington. And they also played Washington's Grand March, along with Hail Columbia and the March from Figaro's Marriage. Mm-hmm. So the band, at that time, it was a mixture, but it's not until about 1850 or so that it all turns into a brass band when Edward Leinbach, who was a prominent musician in Salem, he and his two brothers formed a brass band that they called the Salem Band. And it was this band through the 1850s that played at Easter, played at church services, played at picnics, played at any kind of community events in Salem. And it's this band also that is to become the 26th North Carolina. The brothers, these three brothers, Edward Leinbach and James and Julius, they were the core of the band, but the leader of the band was a fellow by the name of Sam Mickey. It's Sam Mickey as we head towards the Civil War. And by the way, Sam Mickey was an amateur musician. He was actually a tinsmith by profession. But it's Sam Mickey who, when the Civil War starts, understands that there are regiments being formed, and bands are signing up to play and support these regiments, and he is understanding of that. The 26th North Carolina Regiment is formed mostly of Moravians, but they are not the first Moravians to enlist in the Confederate Army. There was the 11th North Carolina and the 33rd North Carolina, and also the 21st North Carolina, actually, which was made up of Moravians, had a band. Also, at the beginning of the war, the Salem Band under Mickey played for patriotic events, recruitment events, and stuff like that. But as 1862 rolled around, Mickey was becoming more and more thinking that they should sign up and that they should offer their services to a regiment. And so they approached actually the 26th North Carolina Regiment, which happened to be camped near Salem at New Bern. And Sam Mickey talks about his first interview with the bandmaster, with the commander of the regiment. And one great thing about the 26th North Carolina is that they kept diaries. And so I've got a lot of stuff here I'll read from their diaries, which will give you great insight of their thinking. So Sam Mickey, he says, quote, "I was sitting in the lobby of Gaston House, New Bern, which is a hotel, when a man wearing a colonel's uniform came in with a loaf of bread under each arm. This was Zeb Vance. I spoke to him and told him my errand. Colonel Vance replied, 'You are the very man I am looking for. You represent the Salem Band. Come to my regiment at Woods Brickyard, 4 miles below New Bern.' The next morning, I went down to camp and was met by Captain Horton of Company C And as a result of my visit, the band was engaged, and it was first paid for by the officers. So that's how Sam Mickey got into the 26th North Carolina. The colonel, Zebulon Vance, was, yeah, it's a great name. And by the way, he goes on to become the governor of North Carolina. And so they enlist in the 26th, and they bring a total of eight guys. And they are outfitted with a nice new, spanking new, brand new uniform. It's a frock uniform made of cadet jean wool with brass buttons. And this is very interesting in that there's only one picture of them in this uniform. And it's a very distinctive uniform. While when you look at a lot of Confederate uniforms, they're either wearing short coats or vests and stuff. There wasn't really anything like a regulate. There were regulation uniforms, but nobody kept to them. But the band wore the long frocks, which is very interesting, with the addition of, like I said, this jean wool cloth and two stripes on the sleeve. And we'll talk more about that. Is that the
uniform that your band uses?
Exactly. And I'll talk about that when I talk about how, when we got started. But that's what the band wore. And they have a picture of them that's taken on the main street of Old Salem in the spring of 1862. Now, as I mentioned before, the history of this band is been very well documented in Harry Hall's book, and I would suggest folks go out and find that book. It's easily available on Amazon. And the book originally was published in 1963 and then updated and republished in 2006. And we got to know Harry Hall a little bit. Really nice man. And the whole book, a lot of it bases its history on the diaries kept by several members of the band. And it's through those eyes that we get a really good sense of what they did. So the band starts off, and if you notice in the original photo, it's just all brass instruments. There are no drums. They didn't use any drums at the very beginning, but they they had to start learning how to be military musicians. So you talk about civilian musicians who are now thrown in to a regiment, so it's a different kind of life. They've got to be able to play music for parades, dress parades, music that the soldiers would understand. And they talked about, this is really funny, they write about the hardships of doing this. And Julius Leinbach writes, he goes, quote, "One of the most difficult acquirements was to keep step as we marched up and down the lines at dress parade. Our natural gaits were very dissimilar, and as our attention must necessarily be given closely to our music, we would sometimes forget our feet. The parade grounds were sometimes imperfectly cleared of all stumps and runners, so now and then, again, some unsuspecting musician would encounter a snag where his foot would go into a hole, causing him to execute maneuvers not laid down in Hardy's tactics." So that's a nice way of putting that they were having trouble marching up and down.
Yeah. I guess the turf monster that we all encountered in marching band at one point or another existed back then too. Reach out, grab your foot, take you down.
Exactly. Meanwhile, I know the band director, don't look at your feet. Don't look at your feet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So back then they were going through the same stuff. So as I mentioned before, Zebulon Vance, who had been the commander of the 26th, had also been a United States congressman, and he was involved with politics before the war. He leaves the regiment in August of 62 to become governor of North Carolina. Now, Vance, of course, appreciated that Mickey had volunteered the band to the regiment, and he was very fond of them, and he asked them to perform at his inauguration ceremonies in September of '62. Mm-hmm. Now, the band started, of course, putting together a library of music, and that's one of the great things about this particular band, is that the music of the band books survive in the archives of the Moravian Foundation down in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Mm-hmm. And like many, musical compositions unique to this band, a lot of pieces were written without any kind of attributions whatsoever. They would be marked in a book, March number 1 or March number 2, Waltz number 1, things like that. Mm-hmm. But a lot of these pieces were probably written by Edward Leinbach, who was Julius's brother. Edward did not go off to war with the band, but he did write some music for the band. And one of those pieces is a very neat little quick step called the 26th North Carolina Quick Step. It's written for the regiment. Mm. So now, it's 1862. The regiment is, training up. They get a new commander, and the band goes off on a concert tour throughout North Carolina. A recruitment, raise money for the regiment, try to recruit more people. But it's cut short by a yellow fever epidemic. And one of the band members one of the original band members, who was an alto horn player by the name of Augustus Halser, contracts the fever, and he goes home, and he unfortunately passes away. He's the only fatality of the suffered by the band during the entire war.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
Well, hey, yes. One is one too many, but at least it was only one, I guess.
it's unique considering how close they were to the fighting and where they were. It's remarkable that they only had one fatality.
Mm-hmm. And especially how the war ends for them. I won't give it away here, but especially the way the war ends for them, it's incredible that they only lost one. Also,
exactly. So the band, as I mentioned before, plays for the dress parades. They play for church services, being Moravians, of course. Their book has a lot of hymns that they play, because the music is not only important to these soldiers for the military duty, but also helps with their spiritual needs. So the band, performs at church services on Sundays. They also played for funerals. That's an important part of a musician's duty during the Civil War, as it is today, that a band would play at a military funeral. They also played for executions. And Julius Leinbach writes about a very unusual incident that happened at Magnolia, North Carolina. Here's from his diary, quote, January 26, 1863 was the day fixed for the execution of a member of Company B for desertion. He had but 4 or 5 days' notice of his impending fate, but expressed himself as being ready to meet his God. The brigade was formed on 3 sides of a hollow square, the prisoner being placed on the open side with the firing squad a short distance in front of him. The squad had been furnished with rifles loaded by us, the band. Half of them with ball cartridges and the other half with blank cartridges, none of them knowing how his gun was loaded. The assistant adjutant general stepped forward and read the sentence of court-martial to him, which condemned him to be shot to death. Then, to my intense relief, certainly to the one most concerned, another paper was read being his full pardon, and he was permitted to rejoin his company. He declared he would never desert again, nor did he, but he was a good soldier, and he was killed bravely fighting at Gettysburg. So that's an interesting story of, the band not only playing music. Bands would play music as the prisoner was brought out to be executed. They would usually play a death march, Handel's from the Dead March from Saul being the most popular one. But in this instant, not only did they play, but they also helped. They were also the ones responsible for loading the muskets and then mixing them up.
I think it's crazy that they do the people firing the guns the service of not knowing, which one of them was killing the person, but the band loaded every gun, so the band knows that they at least primed the weapon that did the killing. So it's more of a mental blow to the band, I would think, than to maybe the people pulling the trigger. It's crazy.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's a heart-wrenching story. Kind of nice in a way that they spared the man's life, but then to point out that he was killed at Gettysburg is a sad thing. So they spend the rest of 1862 and spring of 1863 encamped in North Carolina. And then in the late spring, with the victory at Chancellorsville, the Confederate Army starts moving forward into Pennsylvania. The 26th North Carolina at that time was then under the command of Harry Burgwin, who was 21. He was a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute. He was called the Boy Colonel. Can you imagine at the age of 21 being a full bird colonel? Wow. And in charge of an entire regiment. They, I believe, were with Heath's division, and they were part of the Confederate Army that now moved north into through Maryland and into Pennsylvania. And of course, the band was very important because they wanted the bands to play music to help, soothe the nerves of people as they came by, their towns. And now the band, the 26th North Carolina, they talk about when they reached the Potomac River and the little interesting things that they had to do, because they were asked to play Maryland, My Maryland all the time. Because they were sure that there were, sympathizers in Maryland who, upon hearing the music, would help and, rise to their cause. But Leinbach writes, quote, "Just as I reached the Maryland side of the river, the Potomac, I stumbled and fell to my knees, doing involuntary homage to the state. When we were then again dressed, one of our men asked us to play Maryland, My Maryland. Our leader being sick, I was the next in authority and declined to do so for reasons of my own. A member of General Pettigrew's staff was close by and heard me. He was seen to smile and he moved away, and not long after, an order or request came from the general that we play that piece of music. I did not decline again." So now, they marched through Maryland, and of course they marched through Pennsylvania in June of 1863, and it's lush. If you've ever driven through Pennsylvania in June and July, it's just gorgeous. The rolling hills, the green. I can only imagine what these Confederates saw, and they were being well fed too, because they were living off the land. And Maryland and Pennsylvania offered us really great food for them. So by the end of June, with the Confederate Army now in Pennsylvania and getting ready for battle that they knew that was coming up, they had a preacher who, of course, gave sermons and tended to their spiritual needs. They had a church service on June 28th, and this is just before the great battle. And one of the guys talks about, quote, "Did you see Colonel Burgoyne during the preaching? He seemed deeply impressed. I believe we're going to lose him on this trip." Sadly, prophetic words, they were fulfilled much sooner as any of us had the remotest idea. The preacher quoted Jeremiah 8-20, saying, "The harvest has passed. The summer is ended, and we are not saved." So there's this great premonition that something is about to happen. And by the way, before I go on with the Gettysburg story, I should point out that the band by this time had picked up a drummer, a guy by the name of Augustus Reich. Gus Reich to his friends. He was known as the Wizard of the Blue Ridge, in that he was not only a good drummer, but he was a magician. And so when the band would do performances, he also would do magic tricks. And his title, the Wizard of Blue Ridge, was in reference to his wizardry skills as a magician. He was quite obviously a very good one, because he was featured many, many, many times, and we see his name on posters a lot.
Yeah.
So they did have a drummer at Gettysburg. So with the battle starting, the 26th North Carolina Regiment went into the battle with about 800 soldiers, and they fought on the first day northwest of Gettysburg, where most of the first day's action took place. The Confederate Army coming down from Cashtown.
Mm-hmm.
The 26th met up and fought against Michigan boys. And on the first day of approximately 800 soldiers, 588 were killed or wounded. Yeah, that was a lot. One of the companies was completely wiped out. And it was during this day that, the band wasn't playing. They were held back, and they were doing their secondary duty, which was as surgeons, assistants, and tending to the men who were wounded. It was one of the guys, it may have been Leinbach, who actually said, by the end of the war, we could cut off a man's leg as well as any surgeon. So you sort of wonder how much they assisted in that surgery.
Yeah.
So after the first day's battle, the second day they were the band was tending to their comrades in the 26th, and they write about that, saying, quote, "With heavy hearts, we went about caring for the wounded. We were sent for by the commanding officer of the brigade, but Dr. Warren sent a note back with Sam Mickey that we could not be spared. A short time later, another order came for us, and we went accordingly to the regiment, where we found men more cheerful than ourselves. We played for some time, the 11th North Carolina playing with us, and the men cheered lustily. We learned afterward from northern papers that our playing could be heard across the lines, and caused wonder that we should play while fighting was going on all around us." So what had happened, of course, is that the order came down from General Heath that he wanted music to be played to keep up the spirits of the men on the second day's battle. And so it was the 26th and the 11th who got together and performed. Of course, both bands had a lot of similar music, so that they were able to form up and play. And that must have been really an interesting sound with everything going on, to hear
I bet.
music floating around. And that's, like I said before, where that quote comes from, Lieutenant Colonel Fremantle. It's just an interesting quote about hearing the waltzes and polkas, which sounded very curious, accompanied by the hissing and bursting of shells. So, and heard by both sides too. So after the Gettysburg, the Confederate Army makes its way back to Virginia. The band was directed to perform at General Heath's quarters on July 15. And then Sam Mickey, the band leader, by the way, Sam Mickey had the honorary title of captain. All his fellow band members called him Captain Mickey, which he kept through the rest of his life. But he was called to General Lee's headquarters. And he was really afraid that something was going to happen. He was afraid that they would be forced to trade their instruments for muskets. And he wrote, quote, General Lee sent a courier that we should report to him. With our regiment terribly reduced, we were a little uneasy about our future condition, fearing the possibility that we might be put into the ranks. We obeyed the order with fear and trembling, feeling very much as a prisoner would who was about to receive his sentence. General Lee received us very kindly and said that he considered our band the best in the Army and hoped that we would do all we could to cheer up the men. We went back to our quarters with light hearts, unquote. So Lee, commended the band. And he was to say during that meeting that I don't believe we can have an army without music. So when you see that quote being floated around, it was actually written or said by Lee to the members of the 26th North Carolina Band. So after this now, for the rest of 1864, or 63 and 64, the band was to remain in Virginia. And they found themselves back in training into the regular routining of Army life, drilling and rehearsing and performing camp concerts. And this is as the regiment was reformed. And by the way, I had mentioned the boy colonel before, Colonel Burgwin. And he was killed that first day at Gettysburg, which is unfortunate. So they were now playing for the division commander, General Kirkland, and they participated in a huge review on September 11th, 1863. The entire Third Corps of the Confederate Army passed in review for Robert E. Lee. Some 30,000 men, which included, according to them, 17 bands. Took 2 hours for all the troops to pass a review. So there we get an indication that there was a lot of Confederate bands out there.
Yeah, right, for sure.
And of course, with drilling troops and everything, I had mentioned before in my earlier podcast how important bugle calls were.
Right.
Now, the 26th North Carolina, there may have been a regimental bugler, but I have not found out any records of that. And they may have had some field music, but for the most part, it was the band, the 26th North Carolina Regimental Band, that provided all the music for them. But, the band, of course, they didn't have to do the field music duties. They didn't have to play bugle calls in the morning and the evening and all that stuff. Well, they were summoned to do that, and it gives a great story of what happened in 1864. Here's the quote from Julius Leimbach's diary. He goes, quote, General Kirkland took a new freak into his head. He sent for Sam and told him he wanted one of us to blow bugle calls for brigade drill. I was selected for the job. That's Julius Leimbach. He was not only a tuba player, but he also played cornet. So He had sent a copy of tactics in which the various calls were given, and I was to memorize a few. But there were so many, and I did not know what commands he would give, that I was in so much the condition of a small boy going to school without knowing his lessons. I had this consolation, however, that if I did not know the different calls, neither did the general, nor did the men. So if I gave the wrong one, no one would be the wiser. So I put up a bold front as I walked up to headquarters at the appointed hour. I was put on a fiery steed and followed the general as he rode to the parade grounds. I could well imagine what the under officers and men were wondering as to what sort of circus performance was to come off. The general gave his command, as for instance, by battalion, right wheel, which was repeated by the regimental and company officers. Then instead of saying, march, I was to give the prescribed call for that maneuver. Sometimes I remembered the correct call. Mostly I knew no more than the various dunce in the ranks as to what tones I should play, but I blasted something out all the same, and it answered the purpose. For 2 hours, this farce was kept up, and then we rode back to camp, wiser men. I was never asked to repeat this performance.
I was gonna say there's a joke to be made there about tuba players never really knowing what's going on, but I'll refrain from making it.
Yeah, it's actually Leinbach. You know, part of that Leinbach family switched during the war from playing tuba to cornet, and I forget who he switched with. They decided just to switch instruments.
Yeah. Why not?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
So the band, of course, playing these duties. They also found themselves working in the hospital, caring for the wounded and the dying. And there were times also they were ordered up to the front lines to play for the troops. And they were to find themselves in Petersburg. And the Petersburg, where they had the long line of Confederate entrenchments, this was to be, of course, the last stand. If they couldn't hold Petersburg, Richmond would fall. So one of the ideas that the Confederates had, because they didn't have many men, was to have the band and troops march back and forth over and over again to give the impression that they were a much bigger army than it were. So the band, along with the regiment, they settled near Petersburg, and once again, it's very monotonous routine going on with the band playing and practicing. And on October 11th, the bands of the North Carolina 26th and the 27th, they teamed up for a grand serenade for the residents of Petersburg, only to be met with a bombardment from Yankee artillery that was close by, and also Yankee bands. So Christmas and New Year's came, and of course didn't look promising for the Confederacy. And before I go on, one of the interesting things too about this band, being made up of Moravians, they participated in the Moravian traditions. One of the traditions, of course, is playing on Easter morning, starting in the cemetery, playing hymns in the darkness up through sunrise. And that still continues in both Salem and Bethlehem. I believe Bethlehem today, mostly in Salem. And so they did that, much to the consternation of non-Moravians in the regiment. They did that on Easter of 1863. The other tradition is playing on New Year's Eve to announce the new year, playing at midnight. One of the heart-wrenching stories for me about this band is that they had been away on furlough for a while, and when they came back, it was in the middle of winter, and it was snowing, and they had hitched a ride on a wagon, and the regiment had been without their band for like a month or so, and when they came back, they came back in the middle of the night, but they struck up a tune, and the regiment was immediately awakened, and they started cheering because their band was back. So now here we are. It's towards, the end of the war. Fort Fisher, North Carolina, had fallen. Petersburg was now under heavy siege. And the band found themselves in the breastworks surrounding Petersburg when they were informed at the end of March to gather whatever belongings they have and move to the rear as quickly as possible. And of course, they write about that in their diary. They wrote, quote, Dan Krause, who was the tenor horn player, Dan and I had just gotten down to the foot of a tree when a mini ball struck just above our heads. I jumped up and said, boys, let's get away from here. Then someone said, the Yankees are coming. And sure enough, a long blue line sparkling with flashes of musketry was moving rapidly toward us, and our men in pitifully small numbers in full retreat. So the band with the army starts moving westward, away from Petersburg, and throwing away anything they couldn't carry, including food. So somehow the band got separated from the regiment, because it's a pretty much, everyone's just leaving quickly as possible. Which leads to a great story here about the band. They said, quote, after we had gone a few miles and it seemed to have gotten away from everyone else, we came to our house where the good lady gave us some bread and meat, for which we returned our acknowledgments by playing Lorena, thereby ending our musical career as the 26th North Carolina Regimental Band, although we did not know it at the time. Someone told us we better stop playing as the Yankees would hear us and certainly try to capture us. And unfortunately, a few days later, the band was captured near Five Forks. I'm not exactly sure who captured them or exactly where they were captured. But all their instruments were taken, except for Sam Mickey, who hid his E-flat cornet in his haversack. Mm-hmm. And this was very sad for the musicians, because they had grown very close to these instruments that they'd played the entire time they were in service. Mm-hmm. They were taken to the federal prison at Point Lookout, Maryland, where they were to spend the next couple months. They were released in July and then made their way home. One of the last entries in the diary that talks about the band as the 26th North Carolina Regimental Band is very interesting and very well worth repeating. Quote, then we realized more fully that we were prisoners indeed, and that each step we were forced to take was away from home and all we held most dear. When would we be permitted to see our loved ones or even communicate with them and relieve their anxiety they would naturally feel for our safety and welfare? Where were we going, and what treatment would be accorded us? Sad and gloomy indeed were our thoughts. Farewell, home and friends. Farewell, Southern Confederacy. Farewell, 26th North Carolina Regiment. Farewell, 26th North Carolina Regimental Band. No more would we play for guard mounts and dress parade. Never again shall your familiar airs cheer and be cheered by men. For 3 years we're wont to call you our band. There is no more 26th North Carolina Regiment. It has passed into history, and such a history as any organization might well be proud. So that's a great ending for that band. And in July of 65, the boys, all of them, reached home, and like members, like thousands of other Confederates and Southerners, the veterans who were returning to their homes, they went on, of course, living their lives and helping rebuild the nation. And as we mentioned before, the band was then recreated in 1960s as part of the centennial. But the band actually still lived on. It existed before the war as the Salem Band, made up of Moravians who were businessmen in the town, tinsmiths, bookbinders and things like that. Mm-hmm. After the war, they put away their uniforms and went right back to performing as the Salem Band. Gotcha. So that's a brief history of the band.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. Do you know, did the Salem Band then continue to exist today? Is that one of these continuously?
Yes. I believe it's all brass. They've added woodwinds, but what's interesting is to point out that they're the two traditions. The Salem Band was reformed again under a fellow by the name of Bernard Fole, and Bernard was to be a member of that band for the late 19th century, all the way up like through 1950s. And the band was, reformed as the Salem Band, but also there was what was called the Easter Band. And this was the band that would play the church services and would play on Easter in the cemetery. What is interesting is that to try to find this book, not only Harry's book, but there's a book called The Salem Band by Bernard Fole, and it was written in 1953. And he also chronicles the history of the band from its start in the late 18th century all the way up to the 1950s. And in my research and the photos that were sent to me, it's very interesting seeing pictures of the band with members of the 26th North Carolina as they get older and older. As you look at photos that are taken in the latter part of the 19th century, there's Sam Mickey with his cornet, and then he later moves to the alto horn. And Sam Mickey actually returns to Gettysburg in 1913 for the 50th anniversary of the battle. And there's a photo of him and his wife there. So the band continued on, and it still exists today. Outside of the recreation they did in the 1960s, I don't believe they've done anything further with recreating that band. But we have, and I'll talk about that too.
Real quick about Harry Hall's book. I know that the primary title is A Johnny Reb Band from Salem, but even while I was reading it, I wasn't quite sure how to make sense of the subtitle, The Pride of Tarhelia. What is Tarhelia? I don't think it even mentions it in the book.
I believe that has to do. I should have had this answer for you ready to go.
No, I'm
but
sorry.
Not being from North, they're called the Tar Heel State.
Right.
The Tar Heels. So I think that has something to do with that. And I'm not sure where Tar Heel comes from. And now hopefully everybody who listens to this podcast will write in the comments below
there we go.
where Tar Heel comes from. But one of the things I think about, if you're stuck in tar, you're pretty steadfast. You're going to stand, not move. And North Carolina was a state that, even though it was part of the Confederacy, I think it may have been like the last state to actually join the Confederacy. They were very, concerned about, they were their own entity. In fact, a lot of their troops did not wear CSA belt buckles. They wore NC belt buckles. And in fact, when we do our band uniform and recreation, we wore NC belt buckles, not Confederate buckles. The buttons, that was another thing. The North Carolina uniforms had their own buttons, their own state symbol, rather than the Confederate States of America symbol. So they wanted to be their own. And in fact, the governor, towards the end of the war, refused to let anybody else except for North Carolina troops wear their uniforms. So so that might be part of the whole Tar Heel thing.
Gotcha. Is there any last, I guess we could say, historical band things that we want to ask or mention in this segment?
Well, the original band, I think it's important to remember that, they were religious men. They were Moravians, but they were also very patriotic men who really felt that they had a duty to their country. And their country was, the state of North Carolina, and that they wanted to do their duty in this war, to help support it any way they could. And the best way they could was through music, because the Moravians, I believe, they don't encourage fighting. they didn't want members, to actually pick up weapons. And so this was a way for them to support their state. So, and they did it, and they went through some really tough times during the years that they served. They saw the worst part of war. But they lived through it, and they lived, to tell the tale. And one of the great things is that they kept the band books, the only complete band books of any Confederate band. And they have the diaries. Julius Leinbach, wrote a thing about the history of the 26th North Carolina, and would do presentations to, like, the Daughters of the Confederacy. He would do programs all the time and talk about the band. So there was this continuing interest. And then, of course, they kept playing. And Sam Mickey, of course, being, this great cornet player, continued on doing what he was doing, even though he was working as a tinsmith. And by the way, if you go to Salem today, you'll see the original tinsmith shop where he worked. It's got a big tin pot out, huge tin pot out there. It's pretty cool. And I kept saying Salem. Today it's called Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Right. But if you go down there is the historic Old Salem. That's with original buildings. So if you get a chance, it's wonderful. And the foundation is close by.
Yeah, very cool. I will say that while I was reading Harry Hall's book about this band, it really helped humanize that, side of the war. It's no secret that I'm from New York, and, that I would say that the South was in rebellion and, all that kind of stuff. But this book really makes you feel for this group of guys. It kind of like had the same feeling of while I was reading and then later watching Band of Brothers on HBO, and how it's able to go through the entire war and pre-war and post-war with this small company of people, and you're really able to hear their story. I felt the same thing reading this book and learning about the boys from the 26th Band. And that humanizing effect really made the entire war a little bit more complicated in my head. It's not as black and white or cut and dry as a lot of people tend to want to make it, with aligning with regional alliances or whatever. So it made me feel very unexpected.
It's you bring up an excellent point there, that the story is about, quote unquote, a band of brothers, and that this could have easily have been the band from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Right. The whole, what we try to do when we tell the story is tell the story of these men and what they did in a war situation. And it could have been Union, could have been Confederate. The only, just the color of their uniform gives it away. And it's very interesting also, by using that term Band of Brothers. When you go down to Salem today, there is a Moravian graveyard, a cemetery. It's called, I think it's called God's Acre. And the boys in the band are buried close by. So when you go to visit. So they still remain to this day eternally a band of brothers.
Yeah. And we did I forget if it was included in an episode or not, but they're I don't know, best way of saying this is where we tread on the difficult ground. But it's been brought up before of how people may feel uncomfortable wearing the gray uniform, even if they're depicting a band kind of, everything associated feeling uncomfortable. We kind of touched on it a little bit, but what are your thoughts on putting, especially residing in Maryland, a border state, you get the idea, but I don't know, a good way of asking it, what's your justification maybe for being comfortable with wearing these uniforms?
Well, we're trying to tell a story, most importantly, of these men. And we want it to be as accurate as possible. If it was a Union band, we'd be wearing Union uniforms, but they were Confederate bands. So we wanted to reproduce that uniform that they wore. What we try to stay away from in all our, presentations or any, for lack of better, word, political points of view of the Civil War. Mm-hmm. We're just trying to tell a story of Moravian musicians who were caught up, in a situation where they wanted to support their state, and the best way they could do it was through their music. And the story tells a very unique perspective of these men who were, not only skilled brass players, but they had other duties. They had to, put the muskets together for an execution. They had to play at funerals. They had to help the surgeons. And like I said, it could have very well have been a Union band. It's a very unique story, and we're happy to tell it in the light of and view of these musicians.
You bring up a good point that like the experience, at least when you're talking about the bands, I feel like between, the two sides, the experiences of the band were largely the same. I mean, they're playing, kind of for the same reasons, and they're doing a lot of the same, extra musical services during the war. So I think the bands, I mean, we've covered, they had a very unique position in the Civil War, and it is an interesting story that needs to be told and is an important part of American music history. So it's, I think, on the table, to tell it. It's fair to tell, the story of the people.
And the other thing too is that when we do performances, presentations on the history of the band, we gear our program and do it in a chronological order, starting from the one selection, the pre-war. Talk about what happened. We relate the stories through the diaries and letters. We do it in two parts. We go up to Gettysburg to take a intermission, and then Gettysburg to the end. But what I think really appeals to audiences is that not only they get to hear the music as performed on original instruments, and we always point this out, that you're hearing this music as it would have been heard 160 years ago. These are not modern instruments reproducing the sounds. These are the actual instruments with using original mouthpieces and things like that. So this is the way it would have sounded. Also, the uniforms, this is the way they looked. And then people will come up afterwards and look at the uniforms, and I should talk about that uniform that we wear in just a bit, but they're very interested in seeing it up close, and then feeling the material and stuff, and actually looking at the cut of how these uniforms were. They were exactly like Union uniforms, except they had a different color.
So let's talk about those uniforms. You alluded earlier that there were some differences between some of the North Carolina regiments and the rest of the Confederate Army. So do you guys model then the exact uniforms that the 26th North Carolina Band wore from the pictures you have and everything?
Exactly. Unfortunately, there's only one photograph of the band, and that was taken in front of a bakery on Main Street. And it has a description. The description is a cadet jean wool cloth. It says with brass buttons. So we notice on the photograph, that it's a frock. It's not a short coat that most Confederate soldiers wore, but it's actually the longer coat that goes down to the knee, and it's fitted to fit, form fitting, with brass buttons. So with that information in hand, we decided, okay, let's see if we could find a person who knows this material. So we contacted Ben Tart, who makes who does cloth in North Carolina. He's done a lot of Civil War uniforms. So we gave him the information. He goes, "Oh yes, I know exactly what this is. It's it's a combination of wool and cotton. It's kind of a rougher type of weave to it, but this is the material that was used." And cadet gray, which it's the same type of gray that of the uniforms at West Point. So what we decided, and talked to Ben about this, is that we did not want to use modern coloring dye for the cadet gray, and which he strongly suggested. Yeah, that's great. Use original vegetable dye that was used in these uniforms. So we got bolts of this uniform, and we had my wife Heather and her friend Allison, who have experience in making costumes for theaters. We got all the patterns, and they made the uniforms for us. Now, what's interesting, if you see pictures of our band today, when we first started, the uniforms are that nice light blue gray. The cadet gray color. As the years go by and we wear them in the sun, guess what color they turn into? Take a wild guess.
Right, the brownish one.
Very good. They turn brown, and unlike since it's not a modern dye which will hold up against sunlight, the same material used back then starts to turn the cadet gray into a brown color, which of course is the butternut that they talked about all the time. So butternut uniforms were actually gray uniforms at the beginning, and then you wore them out in the sun and they turn. So that's the material we used. For the brass buttons, we were unsure because all it said was large brass buttons. We knew we were not going to use the Confederate States of America emblem because North Carolina troops didn't wear them. So there were two types of buttons that North Carolina had, one with the state seal, and then the other one had what was called a starburst on it. I think we used the starburst for our uniforms. For the hats, we went to Greg Starbuck, who was a terrific hat maker, and had him we gave him the material, and he made wonderful hats for us. What's interesting also about the uniforms, that inside the uniforms, we used different patterns of cotton cloth. So everyone in the band has a slightly different inside, for the lining. So to make it more authentic for that. So the uniform is about as authentic as you can possibly get for this. And it's so great when we have people who come up and look at us, especially when we've done events. We've had people who walk up to us and, wow, that's a real band uniform. You guys look like a band, not just thrown together a whole bunch of hodgepodge of people who went out and purchased uniforms from different vendors. We actually have uniforms that were made by one specific. So that in combination with the instruments that we use, playing the music that's transcribed from the archives. It gives us the sense, it gives people the sense of what really happened back then.
Yeah. And that was kind of the next question that I was going to ask, is when you're doing your 26th North Carolina impression, are you only playing music that is transcribed from the archives, or do you play anything else, maybe that's documented in a diary or something, that you're able to arrange yourself?
Most of the material comes from the archives.
Okay.
The last thing that you said about having maybe a piece that we found that might be documented that we can't find, that we want to add, we'll put into it. But for the most part, 99% of when we do a music performance is the music of the 26th North Carolina, because we're telling that story.
Right.
We don't, we're not gonna play Rally Round the Flag or Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Yeah, right.
Because we're telling a very specific story. Right. And got music, of course, copies of those archives, the chicken scratch, and took a lot of that and put those on computer. The Moravian Music Foundation has put out 3 volumes of music, which unfortunately we can't use any of it for various reasons. So we had to, create our own library. We've been doing a lot of performances. We actually traveled to Salem, North Carolina in 2005. We did a program for the Moravian Music Foundation, and at that time we visited the graves of the band members, did a short little homage to them. We also traveled out to Columbus, Ohio for a Moravian Music Conference in 2006, where we did a presentation. In 2008, the band participated in the Gettysburg 145th anniversary, which was huge. And we recreated what the band did. We actually, when they were doing one of the reenactments, or the battle reenactments, we went out in the middle of the field and we played. And it was surreal, because to hear the muskets and the artillery going off and playing, we got the feel as to what those guys must have heard. Yeah. Of course, without the real bullets.
Right. A little less danger.
Yeah, of course. Well, without fear.
Yes. We've had a great relationship with the 26th North Carolina reactivated regiment. They are a reenactment group that actually has members, descendants from the original regiment. And we've done a few events with them. They've come up to Gettysburg and we've supported them. In 2008, we were invited by them to go to Raleigh to play for the return of the 26th North Carolina battle flag. And it's there. We met descendants of the Mickey family and the Leinbach family, who we also met the Leinbach family at the Moravian Music Foundation. And we've been in touch with them. And those folks have sent photos to me too, which have been wonderful. We've gone down to New Bern, North Carolina to play for the anniversary of that, a dedication for a monument. The Remembrance Day parade, which is held every year. One year we had the Federal City Brass with the Union guys, and we did the 26th North Carolina with the Confederates. 2 bands in one. It was quite a feat, but we were able to pull it off.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
The band is also played at church services for Moravians. We've done love feasts. I don't know if you know what a love feast is. It's a service. The best part of the service is where they stop in the middle and serve coffee and sweet bread. It's excellent. The band is, like I said, we've done a lot of programs, and always with the idea that it is a presentation as, the program. the history of this terrific band. One, the return of that battle flag was a very moving experience. We also, when we met with the 26th up in Gettysburg, they marched across the field recreating their charge during Pickett's charge, and the 26th North Carolina is the only regiment to have had its colors make it all the way up to the Union line. There's a monument. If you go to Gettysburg, near the high water mark, near the cannons where Alonzo Cushing is, just to the right of that, there's a small monument to the members of the 26th North Carolina Regiment. That's the place where they made it. The color bearers, there was like 3 of them left by that time, had made it all the way to the line. And by this time, the Union guys stopped shooting at them. And they started cheering for them because they were cheering their bravery. And then they captured their flag. But what was kind of nice was that when we recreated this with the modern guys, they had descendants of the color bearers who took the colors, and that was really something.
Yeah, that's neat.
So the band is, I'm sorry, the band has done a lot of great stuff, and unfortunately, things seem to have slowed down after the 150th anniversary was over. And now with the COVID, it's we're not getting much calls for doing things.
Right.
Yeah, of course. I was wondering, when you guys do, when you did have engagements and stuff, were you sticking to the numbers in terms of what they had as well? Like, they weren't a huge band. I think that they were on average around 8, I think, right?
Correct. They had 12 at the most at one time, and no, we'll use up to like 15 or 16 guys in the band. The original band had 1 E flat cornet, 2 B flat cornets, 2 alto horns, a tenor horn, baritone, and a bass horn, which meant with 1 E flat cornet player, Sam Mickey must have had lips of leather.
Oh yeah, seriously. Yes. And if you were sticking to their actual instrumentation, I was wondering if the drummers get to rest for the first half of the concert and then show up when the drummers got there.
Well, yeah, no, unfortunately, and to make it authentic, we really should have one of those guys do magic tricks too.
Yeah, there you go. That could be cool.
We try to use the drums sparingly, but you got to keep them busy.
And, and idle hands right back there.
Exactly. One of the things too is that we not only do we use the drums sparingly, we use the cymbal even more sparingly. There was no cymbal player with that band, and unfortunately, I've heard some recordings of playing this music using a lot of cymbal, and it's, to my ear, it's just jarring at times, because I know that there wasn't a cymbal player. Trying to make it as authentic as possible, but it's okay. And then, of course, so there are some bands who play this and they use modern instruments, and that's fine. People are, it's a great way of, introducing people to this music. And I've actually done some modern brass quintet transcriptions of some of the music that I'm making available.
That's awesome.
Yeah, you have to. You have to lower the key because the E, to put it into more playable keys for modern brass quintets. Otherwise, the first trumpet player is going to, not make it the first couple lines.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's something that Stephen and I actually really enjoyed when we interviewed Randy Cable and was talking about his arrangements of the Brass Band Journal and also the Smithfield Brass Band, brass band books from a Virginia Confederate band.
Right, the 19th Artillery, right?
Yeah. How he, has, especially for the brass band arrangements that he did, he gave it B flat subparts for all the E flat instruments, as options, but then also lowered it, I think, a fourth or a fifth, like you were saying. And, that doesn't eliminate the option of playing, the original music. What he did doesn't, replace anything. It just provides another option for people becoming introduced and familiar with this music, which we loved. We thought it was great. So that's right in line with what you're doing with your quintet stuff. I think it's great.
Right. And I try to tell people, this is not, if you want the original, you can find those and play those.
Yeah, definitely.
But these are great for groups that, like you said, introduce people to this music. I really encourage people to find the book on Harry Hall. Also on my website, tapsbugler.com, I have a short history of the 26th North Carolina Band that I did. And I've done presentations about the band at certain organizations, and it's been great. I did one for the East Coast Brass Conference. But unfortunately, it was only limited to 25 minutes. It's very tough to tell this. Very tough to tell the story of this band.
Right.
But we do have, a Facebook page. The 26th North Carolina Band has its own Facebook page. I mentioned before the 26th Regiment, Infantry Regiment. They have their own Facebook page, and they also have a website. And some of the arrangements from the band book has been recorded on our CD called Better Than Rations or Medicine. So I encourage people, if they want to hear some of this music, they can listen to the Fennell recording, which is wonderful. The American Brass Quintet, their 2 volumes of this music recorded is wonderful. And then there's ours, the Better Than Rations or Medicine. And then if you can possibly find anything from the 11th North Carolina Band, it's tough trying to find it.
They're hard to find. Actually, a local Fairfax musician, Sam Loudenslager, near us, used to play with the 11th, and he was able to give me. I purchased the 5th volume through eBay, I think, but he was able to give me CDs to copy of volumes 2 through 4. So I was able to have 4 out of the 5 in CD form from the 11th, which is awesome.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. That's wonderful. I'm really glad to hear that you're keeping these archives of these recordings.
Definitely.
Because one day, people are going to need to find this for research. And what I'm really happy is to see that we have this young generation coming up who are interested in this. And if you guys can, get with George Mason and maybe have a center for Civil War music, because there was actually a center for Civil War music up at Shepherdstown University. I don't know if it still exists.
Interesting. I didn't know.
It's the George Tyler Moore Center, who interestingly enough was the brother of Mary Tyler Moore. And so you might want to check into them and see if they are still doing something, because it'd be nice to have a center where articles and papers and dissertations and instruments and recordings can all go.
Yeah,
definitely. All right, well, thank you so much, Jari, for coming on to the show for a second time. We've already kind of discussed off camera how we can get you back a third time. So listeners, be looking forward to a third episode, hopefully coming out, in the next while here. But yeah, thank you so much, Jari, for coming out again. It was awesome getting to pick your brain and hear about this awesome history of the 26th North Carolina.
Thanks for having me. Enjoyable, and thank you for everything you guys are doing to keep this history alive.
Thank you again, Jari Villanueva, for coming on for a second time onto the Early American Brass Band podcast. As the first time, as we got kind of to the end of the interview, we were already brainstorming about how to have Jari on for what is now this episode. So that happened again. We're looking forward to having Jari on a third time. So stay tuned and keep listening. He'll be back.
Definitely. And we will have links to everything we mentioned in the episode up on our show notes page on our website for this episode. That's eabbpodcast.com. If you want to get in touch with us, you can do that on social media. We're on all platforms and YouTube. You can also email us at eabb.podcast@gmail.com. We love hearing from listeners. So please don't hesitate to get in contact with us there. Also, as always, the website has a bunch of resources on it, so we hope you'll join us over there and check it out and maybe dive down a rabbit hole. Our featured album this week is Better Than Rations or Medicine by the Federal City Brass Band. As we mentioned, I think in the episode, this album contains a lot of 26 North Carolina music. It's performed by the Federal City Brass Band, and as you have come to expect with all of Jari's groups and projects, it's some phenomenal playing. And we will have links to this album on the show notes page on our website, eabbpodcast.com. Just click on show notes, scroll to the bottom, and you'll find links to purchase this album and some more information about it. We hope that you'll check it out, and I think that wraps it up for this week's episode. We will talk to you again in 2 weeks. Take care until then.